In the summer of 1941, the largest invasion in human history thundered eastward. 3 million men, thousands of tanks, and the black wings of the Luftwaffe descended upon the Soviet Union in a storm called Operation Barbarossa. It was not simply a clash of armies, but of worlds, an apocalyptic struggle to decide the fate of Europe. What if the gamble had paid off? What if the Reich's iron fist had closed around the heart of Russia? In the shadows of history, the answer remains buried, whispered in forgotten files. In the autumn of 1941, as the rains turned the Russian countryside into a sea of mud, German High Command made a final gamble: the drive on Moscow. Operation Typhoon had begun with colossal ambition: 3 massive pincer movements aimed at encircling the Soviet capital. In our own timeline, the Wehrmacht faltered. The weather, logistics, and Soviet resilience stopped them short of the Kremlin. But in this alternate history, the storm played differently. The ground froze earlier than expected, hardening roads that had been seas of sludge. German tanks, freed from the morass, thundered forward with renewed speed. The Soviets, exhausted by months of retreat and with reserves stretched thin, could not hold the line. By late November, forward units of the 4th Panzer Army broke through at Istra, only a handful of miles from the heart of Moscow. The Soviet State Defense Committee ordered a last stand, but the chaos of evacuation spread through the streets. Stalin, after agonizing debate, was convinced by his generals to withdraw eastward to Kuibyshev. Contrary to popular belief, the capital had not been prepared for complete destruction. Many of the bridges, factories, and rail junctions remained intact as German divisions swept in. For the first time since Napoleon, Moscow had fallen to a foreign invader. The immediate consequences were staggering. With Moscow captured, Soviet communications fractured. The General Staff, deprived of its central hub, struggled to coordinate between the northern front around Leningrad and the southern front near Rostov. Army groups that had once relied on centralized orders found themselves isolated, uncertain, and vulnerable. German intelligence, long frustrated by Soviet resilience, seized upon this collapse. Encirclements once again became possible, and entire Soviet armies were pocketed and destroyed in the days that followed. German morale, shaken by the grueling months of mud and cold, surged. Hitler, addressing the Reichstag in triumph, declared that the Asiatic Colossus was broken. Yet beneath this triumph lay darker realities. Moscow was not merely a military target. It was the psychological and political core of the Soviet state. Its fall sent shockwaves through the Allied world. In London, Churchill's government convened emergency sessions, fearing that Stalin might sue for peace. In Washington, intelligence assessments painted a bleak picture. If Moscow had been lost and the Soviet leadership driven into exile, could the Red Army still fight? President Roosevelt, preparing his nation for war but still bound by isolationist sentiment, faced the specter of a Europe dominated by Berlin and Tokyo. In secret memoranda, American strategists debated whether the collapse of Russia might necessitate direct intervention on the continent far sooner than planned. For the German command, however, Moscow's capture did not deliver the decisive blow they had imagined. The Soviet Union did not surrender. Stalin, defiant even in exile, addressed the nation from Kuibyshev. Soviet propaganda reframed the disaster. Moscow was but one city, the motherland was vast, and the struggle continued. The Red Army, though battered, fought on from the Volga to the Caucasus. Soviet industry, already relocated to the Urals and Siberia, continued to pour out tanks, artillery, and aircraft. And the Russian winter, that eternal ally, descended with ferocity upon German troops occupying a city ill-prepared for their presence. In the frozen ruins of Moscow, German soldiers endured unimaginable hardship. Supply lines stretched hundreds of miles across hostile territory, plagued by partisan ambushes and Soviet air raids. Food was scarce, ammunition scarcer still. Civilians who had not fled were sullen, resistant, and often complicit in sabotage. The German army had seized the prize, but they found themselves holding a poisoned chalice. Each day in Moscow consumed resources that could not be spared. Each day, the Soviet Union, though bloodied, rebuilt its strength. Strategically, however, the fall of Moscow shifted the war's trajectory. In the short term, Germany gained crucial months of momentum. The capture of the capital emboldened Hitler to divert forces southward toward the Caucasus in 1942 with greater confidence. The myth of German invincibility deepened, not only in occupied Europe but in the minds of potential allies. Turkey, long wavering, leaned closer to the Axis, tempted by the prospect of joining a winning side. Japan, watching the collapse of Soviet defenses with keen interest, reconsidered its northern strategy, seeing opportunity where once there was caution. The Allied response became urgent, desperate. Britain accelerated its bombing campaign, striking at the heart of Germany with renewed intensity. American Lend-Lease shipments were doubled, though the question loomed: how to deliver them now that the Soviet gateway appeared broken? Arctic convoys braved nightmarish journeys, but the logistical network was fragile. Every sinking of a merchant vessel felt like a nail in the coffin of Soviet resistance. Long-term, the ripple effects of Moscow's loss extended beyond the battlefield. The Soviet Union, weakened and scarred, emerged from the war, if it survived at all, in a vastly diminished state. The Cold War, as history would later call it, might never have emerged in the same form. A Soviet Union stripped of its capital, forced into relocation, and reliant upon Allied support, could not claim the mantle of superpower with the same authority. Eastern Europe's future would hang in doubt. Would Germany, entrenched in Moscow, dominate the continent indefinitely, or would a Western-led alliance, fearful of a Nazi Eurasia, move to crush Berlin sooner and at greater cost? For the people of Moscow, the occupation was a nightmare. Repressive decrees imposed order with brutality. Resistance fighters risked their lives in the shadows, striking when they could. German records, unearthed decades later, reveal plans for the city's transformation into a German colony. Its Slavic population deported, its landmarks razed, its culture erased. That future, mercifully unrealized in our reality, stood as a specter in this alternate path. As months turned to years, the myth of Moscow's fall persisted in the Allied imagination as both a rallying cry and a warning. If Moscow can fall, one British intelligence officer wrote in 1942, so too can London, New York or Paris. This is not a Russian war alone, it is the war of civilization itself. In the shadows of that chilling thought, the Western Allies resolved their course. The timetable for American entry into Europe accelerated. Plans that once stretched into the mid-1940s were redrafted for immediate execution. D-Day, in this altered reality, might have come not in 1944, but far earlier. Driven by fear that the II Reich, with Moscow in its grip, would become unassailable. Thus, the Moscow Gambit was both triumph and illusion. For Germany, it promised victory, yet delivered overextension. For the Soviets, it was catastrophe, yet not annihilation. And for the Allies, it was a grim awakening. The path to defeating Hitler would be far bloodier, far costlier, and far less certain than they had dared to imagine. In this alternate chronicle of 1941, the world teetered on the edge of a new order, one born not of liberation, but of the fall of an empire's beating heart. In the summer of 1942, Hitler's eyes turned south. Operation Blue, the grand offensive of that year, was designed to strike deep into the Soviet Union's southern flank. Its centerpiece, Operation Edelweiss, sought the oil fields of the Caucasus, the lifeblood of the Soviet war machine. In our own history, German forces came close, but the advance stalled at the foothills, their reach exceeding their grasp. In this alternate course, however, the Wehrmacht achieved the unthinkable. The capture of Baku, the crown jewel of Soviet oil production. The drive began with ferocious intensity. Army Group A, under Field Marshal Wilhelm List, pushed through the Kuban steppe with an urgency born of fuel desperation. German panzers slashed across the plains, aided by Romanian and Italian divisions eager to prove their worth. The Luftwaffe flew endless sorties over the Caspian corridor, bombing railways and bridges, cutting Soviet supply lines to ribbons. The Red Army, battered after the losses around Kharkov and Rostov, could not contain the German momentum. By late September, advance units reached Grozny. Within weeks, the march on Baku had begun. Here, geography played as much a role as strategy. The rugged Caucasus Mountains, long considered a natural barrier, now became the stage of an improbable assault. German mountain divisions, Gebirgsjäger trained in alpine warfare, clambered across the ridges, often fighting at altitudes where oxygen was thin and every ascent came at a human cost. Soviet defenders resisted with bitter tenacity, but their supply lines were crippled, their reserves depleted. In this scenario, the German spearhead broke through, descending into the oil-rich plains of Azerbaijan. On October 19, 1942, German units of the 1st Panzer Army entered Baku. The oil fields, though damaged by Soviet demolition teams, remained partially intact. With astonishing speed, German engineers, brought in with detailed plans, set about restoring production. The immediate effect was a transformation of Germany's strategic position. For months, the Wehrmacht had been strangled by fuel shortages. Tanks sat idle, aircraft grounded, entire offensives delayed for lack of gasoline. Now, with the Caucasus fields under Axis control, Hitler's armies gained a lifeline. Though transportation remained a challenge, pipelines and Black Sea convoys carried crude to Axis refineries. For the first time since 1941, the German war machine ran not on fumes, but on a steady flow of oil. The capture of Baku sent shockwaves across the globe. In Moscow, Stalin raged. Losing the oil heartland meant not only a crippling blow to the Red Army, but also a potential death sentence for the Soviet Union's industrial base. Already, the Soviet evacuation eastward had stretched logistics to the breaking point. Now, locomotives, aircraft, and tanks ground to a halt for lack of fuel. Soviet mechanized divisions, once the backbone of counteroffensives, devolved into infantry-heavy formations. The Red Army's ability to wage mobile warfare all but evaporated. The desperate reliance on American and British Lend-Lease aid grew tenfold, with convoys rerouted not just with weapons, but with precious petroleum. For the Allies, the implications were grave. British intelligence reported that with Baku in German hands, the Reich's fuel crisis had been solved for years to come. Churchill, already wary of German advances toward the Middle East, now feared that the oil of Iran and Iraq would fall under Axis control. In Cairo, General Montgomery's staff drafted contingency plans for a German drive from the Caucasus through Persia, linking up with Rommel's Africa Corps advancing from the west. A pincer movement that might have sealed the fate of the British Empire in the Middle East now loomed as a terrifying possibility. Washington, too, reeled from the news. Declassified OSS memoranda speak of the German energy supremacy scenario, a nightmare in which Hitler's control of Eurasian oil reserves would render his war machine nearly unstoppable. Roosevelt's advisors, alarmed by the potential of a decades-long Reich sustained by Caucasus oil, pressed for immediate escalation. America's Germany First strategy hardened, and plans for a cross-channel invasion accelerated. For the United States, the war was no longer a distant contest. It was a race against time. Inside occupied Baku, the reality was brutal. The Germans imposed martial rule, exploiting the oil fields with ruthless efficiency. Forced labor was drafted from the local population, many of whom resisted through sabotage and underground networks. NKVD cells, left behind in the chaos, orchestrated strikes against pipelines and refineries. The Caucasus Mountains became a theater of partisan warfare, with villages rising in rebellion, even as German reprisals burned them to the ground. The oil flowed, but it flowed red with blood. Strategically, the seizure of Baku reshaped German decision-making. Buoyed by the success, Hitler insisted that the campaign to Stalingrad be deprioritized. Without the same obsession to capture the Volga city, German forces entrenched in the south securing oil infrastructure and consolidating their gains. This shift spared them the catastrophic losses of Stalingrad that in our own timeline marked the turning point of the war. Instead, the Wehrmacht in late 1942 stood emboldened, its divisions intact, its fuel stores replenished. But the long-term consequences were more complex. While Germany had solved its oil problem, it had overextended itself deep into hostile territory. Supply lines stretching from the Caucasus to Central Europe were perilously thin, vulnerable to Soviet counterattacks and partisan disruption. The Red Army, though crippled, did not collapse. Soviet industry in the Urals and Siberia still churned out weapons in staggering numbers. With American trucks, British aircraft, and Persian corridor logistics, the Soviets fought on, adapting to fuel scarcity with ingenuity, shifting to rail-based logistics and infantry-heavy offensives. The war dragged into a grinding stalemate, one where Germany held the south but bled for every mile elsewhere. In the corridors of power, the Allies grappled with the future. The fall of Baku hardened the post-war calculus. Planners began to envision a Europe where Soviet power was diminished, dependent on Western aid, and politically vulnerable. The seeds of a Cold War looked different in this alternate path. Not a bipolar struggle between Washington and Moscow, but the looming shadow of a Nazi Reich dominating Eurasia, forcing the Anglo-American alliance to take unprecedented risks to prevent a permanent German hegemony. The Caucasus Prize, then, was not merely oil, it was the possibility of a longer war, bloodier and more uncertain than history delivered. For Germany, it was a triumph that promised to alter the balance of power. For the Soviets, it was a disaster that threatened their very survival. And for the Allies, it was a warning. If Hitler could seize Baku, what could stop him from seizing the future itself? In the secret archives of London and Washington, the fall of Baku was studied as the nightmare scenario, the moment the war might have turned irrevocably toward a German century. Far to the north, where the Barents Sea churned with ice and steel, another front of the war unfolded, one often overlooked, yet vital to the Soviet Union's survival. The Arctic convoys, lifelines from Britain and America, delivered tanks, trucks, aircraft, and food through the brutal northern seas to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. In our own history, these convoys endured staggering losses but never broke. In this alternate path, however, the German gamble succeeded. Murmansk fell, and with it, the Soviet Union's northern artery was severed. The campaign began in 1941 with Operation Silver Fox, a combined effort between Germany and Finland to capture Murmansk. In reality, the offensive stalled against fierce Soviet resistance and the unforgiving terrain. But here, the circumstances aligned differently. German mountain troops, reinforced earlier and better supplied, exploited weaknesses in the Soviet line. The Luftwaffe established near-total air superiority over the Kola Peninsula, pounding ports and rail hubs relentlessly. Finnish forces pressed from the north, linking with German divisions in a coordinated push. By the spring of 1942, the Red Banner Northern Fleet could no longer hold the line. Murmansk fell to Axis control. The short-term consequences were immediate and devastating. The Lend-Lease lifeline through the Arctic convoys was cut off. In London, the Admiralty faced a nightmare scenario. The loss of Murmansk meant convoys could no longer deliver directly into Soviet territory. Arkhangelsk, frozen for half the year, could not compensate. Alternative routes, through the Persian corridor or Vladivostok, were slower, costlier, and perilously vulnerable to Japanese interference or logistical collapse. Soviet commanders, already reeling from the demands of the Eastern Front, now faced shortages of trucks, aircraft, and raw materials at the very moment German pressure intensified. For the Soviets, the loss of Murmansk meant far more than supplies. It was a psychological blow, a humiliation at the hands of an enemy that had penetrated into the Arctic fortress once considered impregnable. Stalin, furious at his generals, ordered executions for failures of defense. Secret NKVD files describe frantic efforts to redirect supplies overland from Persia, stretching an already exhausted logistical network across deserts and mountains. The Red Army's mechanized divisions, so dependent on American Studebakers and British Matildas, found themselves crippled by scarcity. Offensive operations faltered. Defense became the only option. In Germany, the capture of Murmansk was celebrated as a strategic coup. The Arctic coastline now served as a forward base for Kriegsmarine operations. U-boats, once forced to operate from Norway, now prowled directly from Murmansk's ports, extending their reach deeper into Allied shipping lanes. The Luftwaffe, operating from airfields carved into the tundra, threatened Arctic convoys before they even neared Soviet waters. German propaganda declared the Northern Noose complete, a stranglehold on Anglo-American aid to Russia. The Allies, shaken, faced a bitter debate. Churchill, who had staked political capital on supporting the Soviets at all costs, now confronted a near collapse of the convoy system. Admirals in London demanded suspension of Arctic sailings, citing catastrophic losses. In Washington, Roosevelt's advisors argued for redirection through the Pacific, though Japanese dominance in East Asia made the route tenuous at best. Every alternative stretched delivery times by months, and every delay cost Soviet lives on the Eastern Front. In secret correspondence, Churchill warned Roosevelt that, if Russia falls, we may find ourselves alone upon the continent once more. The fall of Murmansk also had wider geopolitical consequences. Finland, encouraged by the victory, deepened its cooperation with Germany, dreaming of territorial gains and recognition as a major Axis partner. Sweden, long cautious, edged closer to Berlin, calculating that Germany's dominance of the north could no longer be ignored. The Arctic, once a frozen periphery, became a theatre of consequence, reshaping the alignment of Northern Europe. Yet the German triumph carried hidden burdens. The Arctic was a graveyard for armies. Supply lines into Murmansk stretched across frozen tundra, vulnerable to Soviet counterattacks and partisan raids. Maintaining control of the port required constant reinforcement, consuming resources desperately needed elsewhere. German troops, unequipped for the brutal winters, suffered casualties not from battle, but from frostbite, disease, and despair. Holding Murmansk proved as costly as taking it. For the Soviets, the loss did not end the war, but it made it longer, bloodier, and more uncertain. Without Arctic convoys, the Soviet Union endured crippling shortages through 1942 and 1943. Soviet offensives were delayed, weakened, or abandoned. Stalingrad, in this timeline, was never reinforced with American trucks and British supplies in time. German forces, instead of being encircled and destroyed, held their ground. The Red Army bled itself white against German fortifications, unable to muster the mobility for decisive counterblows. In the long term, the Arctic gamble changed the war's trajectory. The Soviet Union survived, but only with massive sacrifices. Its role in the eventual defeat of Germany was diminished, leaving the Western Allies to carry a heavier burden. When American and British forces finally crossed the Channel into France, they did so against a Wehrmacht less weakened by the Eastern Front. Casualties soared, campaigns dragged, and victory came later, at far greater cost. And when the war ended, the Soviet Union, starved, devastated, and reliant on Western aid, did not emerge as the equal of the United States. The Cold War, if it came at all, was not the duel of superpowers we remember, but a world where one side stood supreme. The Arctic Gamble, then, was a tale of how a frozen port could change the fate of nations. In cutting off Murmansk, the Germans had achieved what their blitzkrieg alone could not, the weakening of the Soviet Union at its very core. Yet in doing so, they had also dragged themselves deeper into the frozen wastelands of the North, a triumph, as costly as it was fleeting. Still, in the hidden files of Allied war planners, the fall of Murmansk was recorded as one of the darkest contingencies of the Second World War, a reminder that history often turned not on great battles alone, but on lonely ports battered by ice and fire. As the Wehrmacht pressed deeper into Soviet territory, The front lines stretched into infinity, vast expanses of steppe, forest, and swamp. German commanders spoke of a continent swallowed, their armies pushing further east than Napoleon had ever dreamed. But with every mile gained, the land itself turned hostile. In the shadows of birch forests and beneath the marshes of Belarus, an invisible war ignited. The Soviet partisans, coordinated by the NKVD and supplied through clandestine channels, transformed occupied territory into a living inferno. And in this alternate history, their campaign escalated far beyond what the Germans had anticipated, becoming a decisive factor that reshaped the Eastern Front. Initially, German planners dismissed the partisans as rabble, peasants with rifles, bandits preying on stragglers. Yet by 1942, the resistance had grown into a disciplined force. In our history, it harassed but never fully crippled the German war machine. But in this scenario, the partisans received unprecedented coordination. Orders flowed directly from Stavka, intelligence from Allied signals intercepted via the British code-breaking at Bletchley Park. Supply drops parachuted into the forests carried not just rifles but explosives, radios, and medical kits. Rail lines became killing zones, bridges exploded in the night, fuel depots erupted in fire. Every convoy that ventured into the forests of Ukraine or the swamps of Polesia risked annihilation. German reports describe entire trains vanishing into the darkness, their remains found days later, twisted steel and charred bodies. The scale of disruption forced Berlin to act. Heinrich Himmler established special anti-partisan units, deploying SS brigades to pacify the countryside. Operation Bamberg, Operation Cottbus, Operation Hermann, each was designed to sweep the forests clean. Yet these pacification actions quickly devolved into massacres. Villages suspected of aiding partisans were burned, their inhabitants slaughtered. German diaries, preserved in fragments, record the despair of soldiers who realized they were fighting a war without front lines, where women and children became both victims and informants. The brutality, instead of extinguishing the resistance, fanned it into a wildfire. For every partisan killed, 10 more rose from the ashes, fueled by vengeance and the promise of liberation. The effect on German strategy was profound. Divisions that might have bolstered the drive toward the Caucasus or Moscow were instead tied down in endless anti-partisan sweeps. Supply lines that could have carried fuel and ammunition to the front hemorrhaged men and material into rearguard duties. Panzer commanders complained bitterly of shortages, fuel siphoned by partisans, food convoys ambushed before reaching the front. The Wehrmacht, designed for blitzkrieg, found itself trapped in a war of attrition within its own occupied zones. In Berlin, whispers grew. The rear was collapsing even as the front struggled to advance. For the partisans themselves, the war was a crucible. Fighters lived in brutal conditions, hunted relentlessly, surviving on stolen rations and meager Allied drops. Yet their morale hardened with each German reprisal. NKVD directives ordered sabotage to prioritize rail hubs and oil depots, and soon, the rhythm of the partisan war synchronized with Red Army offensives. In the lead-up to Soviet counterattacks, partisan units crippled German logistics in entire sectors. In one chilling operation, partisans destroyed the Smolensk rail junction, severing supplies to Army Group Center on the eve of a Soviet push. German troops at the front, suddenly cut off, described themselves as stranded islands of steel in a sea of fire. Internationally, the Partisan Inferno became a rallying point. British intelligence celebrated their exploits in broadcasts, framing them as evidence that the German juggernaut could be bled from within. Roosevelt cited their resistance in secret memos, describing the partisans as a second front of shadows. In the occupied zones of Europe, whispers of Soviet guerrillas emboldened resistance movements in France, Yugoslavia, and Poland. What had begun as isolated ambushes in Soviet forests became a template for continental insurrection. The German response grew more desperate. The Sicherheitsdienst, SD, and SS units introduced collective punishments, razing villages, deporting survivors, and conducting mass executions. Yet the scale of repression only alienated more of the population. In Belarus, entire regions slipped beyond German control, governed instead by partisan brigades that operated like a shadow state, collecting taxes, distributing food, even conducting trials. German soldiers spoke bitterly of marching through territories where they controlled the roads by day, but by night, the forests belonged to Stalin. The long-term impact of the Partisan Inferno was catastrophic for the Reich. By 1943, Hitler's armies found themselves not only battling the Red Army in the east and the Allies in the west, but also an endless insurgency in their rear. German generals warned that the Eastern Front was bleeding from the inside. The overstretched Wehrmacht lost not only material, but morale. Desertions increased. Letters home spoke of a war we cannot win, for even when we advance, the forests take their toll. Politically, the scale of the partisan war altered Allied planning. Western leaders realized that even if the Red Army faltered, the German occupation would remain unstable. Churchill, in a classified note to his chiefs of staff, wrote, "Hitler may conquer territory, but he cannot conquer its people. The woods themselves conspire against him." American planners, watching the chaos unfold, concluded that German consolidation of the East was impossible, strengthening their resolve to commit to Europe's liberation. For the Soviets, the partisans became both symbol and weapon. Stalin, who once distrusted irregular warfare, now embraced it fully, portraying the guerrillas as heroes of the motherland. Soviet propaganda glorified their exploits, weaving their struggle into the mythology of resistance. Yet NKVD archives, sealed for decades, revealed a darker truth. Discipline was brutal, dissent punished with executions, and loyalty enforced by fear. The partisan war was both liberation and repression, a crucible that consumed all who entered. As the war dragged into its final years, the Partisan Inferno stood as a testament to the limits of German power. Despite victories at the front, despite cities occupied and fields seized, the Reich never subdued the forests, the swamps, the endless shadows where Soviet resistance thrived. It was a war of shadows, a war of fire, and in this alternate history, it became the silent front that drained Germany from within. For when the Red Army finally surged westward, it did so across territories already weakened, already aflame, the path cleared by those who had fought unseen. The Inferno burned not just in the woods of Belarus or the swamps of Ukraine, but in the very heart of the German war machine, consuming it from the inside until nothing remained but ash. When news of Moscow's fall reached Washington in late 1941, followed by the Axis push into the Caucasus and the collapse of the Murmansk lifeline, a chill descended on the Roosevelt administration. The Soviet Union, thought to be the great anvil upon which the German Reich would eventually break, now appeared on the verge of disintegration. American planners had bet heavily on Soviet endurance. But in this alternate path, the Red Army's survival was in question, and the United States faced a dilemma of historic proportions. Intervene in Europe before it was prepared, or allow Hitler to dominate the continent unchecked. The United States had only just been thrust into war by the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The Pacific demanded immediate attention, with the Philippines under siege and the US Navy battered. Yet the collapse of the Soviet Union loomed as the greater threat. German victory in the East would free dozens of divisions for the defense of Fortress Europe, making any Allied invasion unimaginably costly. Secret memoranda circulated in the War Department, warning that, if Russia falls, Germany will command the resources of all Europe, and perhaps the world. The so-called Victory Program of 1941, which assumed the Soviets would absorb the bulk of German strength, now seemed a fantasy. Inside the White House, Roosevelt wrestled with his generals and advisors. George C. Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, pressed for an accelerated timetable, an American landing in North Africa by 1942, followed by a cross-channel invasion no later than 1943. Others urged caution. Admiral Ernest King, wary of diverting resources from the Pacific, argued that America risked overextension. Roosevelt himself understood the political risk. The American public, still reeling from Pearl Harbor, had no appetite for sending sons to die in France or Norway. Yet the specter of a Europe permanently under the Nazi swastika haunted him. If the Soviet Union collapses, one aide recorded him saying, "We may wake to a world where the Atlantic itself is no longer a barrier." Across the Atlantic, Churchill's Britain braced for isolation. British intelligence assessments, declassified decades later, reveal a bleak picture. Without Russia, the Reich could shift its full might westward. British cities, already battered by the Blitz, might face a renewed bombing campaign on an even larger scale. In private cables to Washington, Churchill pleaded for American troops in Europe, warning that delay would be fatal. "We are approaching the precipice," he wrote in early 1942, "and unless the United States joins us on the field, we may go over it together." The dilemma sharpened with German victories in the south. The seizure of Baku granted the Wehrmacht fuel security. The loss of Murmansk starved the Red Army of Allied aid. Soviet counteroffensives sputtered out, their tanks immobilized by shortages, their skies dark without the British Hurricanes and American Airacobras once delivered through the Arctic. Reports filtered in of mass Soviet surrenders, of entire armies dissolved in retreat. Stalin, exiled to Kuibyshev, bombarded Roosevelt with appeals for a second front, at once, at all costs. In the Oval Office, these cables lay stacked on Roosevelt's desk, each one a dagger twisting deeper into his conscience. The War Department began drafting contingency plans under code names shrouded in secrecy. Operation Roundup envisioned an early invasion of northern France, even before American divisions were fully trained. Operation Sledgehammer proposed a desperate landing in 1942 with whatever forces were available, a gamble to relieve pressure on the Soviets. Marshall pressed the case, but the risks were staggering. Understrength divisions, inadequate landing craft, and the likelihood of slaughter on the beaches. Yet every month lost meant the Soviet Union edged closer to collapse, and Germany grew, stronger. At the same time, the Pacific War demanded sacrifice. MacArthur called for reinforcements in the Philippines. Nimitz demanded carriers for the Central Pacific. American resources, stretched to the breaking point, could not meet both demands. Roosevelt's cabinet split along lines of geography, the Army pushing for Europe, the Navy for the Pacific. The president sat at the crossroads of history, forced to choose which empire, Tokyo or Berlin, posed the greater existential threat. The American people, meanwhile, were kept in the dark. Newspapers reported German advances in muted tones, but classified intelligence painted a picture of catastrophe. If Moscow's fall had rattled Washington, Baku's capture sent tremors through Wall Street and Main Street alike. What if Germany could outlast the Allies, buoyed by the oil of the Caucasus and the grain of Ukraine? What if, 5 years hence, the Reich controlled not just Europe, but North Africa and the Middle East? The possibility of a German century loomed, chilling in its inevitability. Ultimately, the American dilemma was not whether to intervene in Europe, but how soon and at what cost. In this alternate path, the decision came earlier, harsher, than in our reality. By 1942, under pressure from Churchill and in fear of Soviet collapse, Roosevelt authorized a premature invasion of North Africa under Operation Torch. Even as American, divisions were green and ill-prepared. The landing succeeded, but at terrible cost, bloodier than history remembers. Plans for a cross-channel invasion were pushed forward, with American soldiers training under the grim knowledge that they would be storming beaches before they were truly ready. Long-term, this acceleration reshaped the post-war world. The Soviet Union, bled nearly to death, emerged from the war crippled, its influence diminished. America and Britain carried the weight of liberation, their armies bearing scars far deeper than in our timeline. When the war finally ended, it was not a bipolar world of two superpowers, but an American-led order with a weakened, dependent Soviet Union on its margins. The Cold War, in this alternate history, was less a duel of titans than the uneasy policing of a broken Europe by the West. The American dilemma, then, was not just about strategy or logistics. It was the moment when the United States was forced to decide the shape of the century. To wait meant ceding the world to Hitler. To act meant sending unready boys into the furnace of Europe. Roosevelt chose action, and in the secret archives of the Pentagon, in memoranda locked away for decades, one phrase appears again and again, haunting in its brevity. Better to bleed now than to live forever in a German world. History tells us the tide turned, that the Red Army rose from the ashes and ground the Wehrmacht into dust. But in another world, the storm might never have broken. A Europe under the swastika, an Asia under the rising sun, an America facing a century defined not by freedom, but by tyranny. These were not fantasies, but possibilities. Scenarios studied in secret war rooms, outcomes feared, but narrowly avoided. Operation Barbarossa was more than a battle. It was the hinge of the 20th century, and it could have swung the other way.